Good morning. Welcome to the Community Review on Hot 92.3. I'm Josefa Salinas, your host. I had the honor recently of attending an event, an incredible Black History Month event that Edison put on. And while I was sitting there, I had no idea that I was going to be introduced to something that would stir a new passion inside of me. From the Frederick Douglass Family Foundation, I was fortunate enough to hear Kenneth Morris Jr. speak. And when he was done speaking, I went up to the creators of the event and I said, I have to meet him. I have to talk with him. I have to find a way to make sure that the world knows about what he's doing, what his foundation stands for, and how we might all get involved and make this one of our community events to get behind, to walk, to revolution for, to do whatever we can do for this passion. What is this passion all about? Abolition through education. He is a descendant of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. Wow, what an amazing lineage. With us this morning, Kenneth B. Morris. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you here. And again, I can't tell you how moved I was by the speech that you gave, but since nobody else heard it in the listening audience, I'm not going to expound on it further other than to say it was amazing.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful day. It was a Black History Month event, as you know, and anytime I have an opportunity to be able to stand up in front of an audience and talk about this incredible lineage that I have, this blood that flows through my veins from two of the most important African-American heroes. And I don't even really like to say African-American heroes because they are truly American heroes. And I look forward to sharing with your listeners today their stories.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, let's tell everybody a little bit about the foundation, the Frederick Douglass Family Foundation, and what it stands for, the purpose and your passion, and what we're trying to get what we will get the audience to understand by the time we're done with this conversation about this passion. It is about.
My mom and I, Nettie Washington Douglass, who is the person that brought the two bloodlines together, and we could talk a little bit about that later, I'm sure, but we started the organization in 2007, the Frederick Douglass Family Foundation, and the idea was to start something that would carry on the legacies of these two great heroes. Now, it was a given that our organization would be about the history and about the legacy, but when we started to think about the types of things that we could do about the future and helping people, both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington were visionaries. And they were about fighting injustice that their people faced, but also anybody that faced an injustice. So we knew that the organization would have to be about helping people. And right around the time that we started the organization, a friend of mine handed me a National Geographic magazine. And the cover story was 21st Century Slaves. And I looked at that and I reacted as most people do the first time they hear about modern day slavery. And I said, slavery doesn't exist. It ended
it's against the law, isn't it?
It's against the law,
Mm-hmm.
and it is against the law. It's not legal in any country around the world, including the United States. But I thought that it had ended with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the work that Frederick Douglass did, and the abolitionists. But as I started to do my research, and I found that there were an estimated 27 million people around the world living in conditions as horrific as the slavery that my ancestors endured. 80% of those 27 million are female and 50% are children. And I have two young daughters who at the time were 10 and 7 years old. And when I found that there were girls that were the same age as my daughters that were forced to service men in the brothels in Southeast Asia 15, 20 times a day, having this lineage, this platform that my ancestors have built through struggle and through sacrifice, I couldn't look my girls in the eyes and walk away from it because I knew that I could use that platform to stand up and say something about it. So the second part of our mission for the foundation is to raise awareness about human trafficking and modern-day slavery. And the way that we do that is where education should start, and that's in schools with students.
Well, yeah, because if we can, I think that's severalfold. If you educate them, then they can get passionate about it. And I think that we have seen in the last 24 months that there is a generation of youth out there who have become politically passionate. It's almost like the political passion that I read about in the 60s, saw in the 70s. Political passion is alive again in this country, slowly but surely. It's not quite to the fever that it used to be,
Right.
but it's coming because these kids are still in grade school. But they're passionate, they're excited, and they're not going to take it anymore. And they're willing to stand up and do something about it. So we need to educate them for that, but to educate them so that it doesn't happen to them, because this isn't just happening in third world countries. 27 million people. There's got to be a few in this country.
It's happening in this country. It's happening in Los Angeles. It's happening in the suburbs. Various forms of human trafficking today, for instance, teen prostitution. And I don't even like using that phrase teen prostitution, because no child can make a decision to sell themselves, sell their bodies, and give the money away to a pimp, or basically what is amounts to a modern day.
Yeah, that's not a decision. That's something that's being forced on them.
It's something that's being forced on them. And these traffickers, these pimps, look for the most vulnerable. And unfortunately, in many of the communities, and I've had the pleasure to travel around this country and speak to more than 50,000 students over the past few years since we've started this foundation. And I see these young girls and these young boys that are vulnerable. They're in situations where they don't have a family life. They're spending 6 hours at school. And when they leave that school, they're back out in the world, and they're in situations where they can be swept up by these traffickers that want to harm them, that want to brutalize them, that want to hold them, want to beat them, want to whip them, and then to profit off their backs. And that's what slavery has always been. The history of slavery is someone profiting off the backs of somebody else, and it's no different now.
So how do we put a picture that people can understand, a face to this? Let's talk a little bit about modern day slavery and what that might look like. I know that the first thing that came to mind for me was the television show Weeds. Very funny show to me, but there was some very serious subjects that are talked about there, and one of them was something very much like this. If everybody remembers, the clothing store that she owned was being used for trafficking drugs, but then all of a sudden they started trafficking young women. Young women were being brought up from this tunnel over from Mexico, and this guy was not letting them go, and they were clearly drugged and dazed, and he took them and did God knows what with these young women. And yes, it was a TV show, but I have to believe that is somebody got that idea from something.
Right.
And it wasn't just thought up out of the top of their head. It was a story. It was a news story. It was something that happened, and I believe that happens. So that kind of gives people a visual of what modern-day slavery could look like. But what else could it look like? What else might they see that they don't realize is right in front of them?
Well, what we do in schools, and I think is unique to the movement, because we always talk about history first, because it's very hard for people when they hear that a young 5 or 6 year old girl is being brutalized and sold for sex. It's very hard for people to even wrap their minds around it. So what we do is first we talk about the history of slavery in this country, Frederick Douglass, the abolitionists, what they did to be able to abolish slavery. And then we transition, and we really have people look through the prism of history to then talk about the need for modern day abolitionists. And I remember being younger and watching the television show series Roots, Alex Haley's show. And I remember thinking that if I lived during that time, during slavery, that I would be an abolitionist. I wouldn't sit back and suffer those types of injustices. And I think all of us feel that way. But the problem with that thinking is that it's very hard for us to prove that to ourselves, because we're talking about crimes of the past. Now, all of a sudden, we can say to young people and the people that we talk to that we're talking about a present-day crime, a present-day human rights issue, and the need for modern-day abolitionists to do exactly what Frederick Douglass did, and that's to communicate the inhumanity of today's slavery to first their community, and then to hopefully the country, and then eventually the world. So by us presenting it within the context of history, we're able to help people be able to wrap their minds that around something so horrific. And we really believe that young people, you talk about the passion that they have, and it's because they're so well connected through all of the social media platforms that they're on.
They're connected minute by minute.
Minute by minute, yeah. Minute by minute. And I hope I get a chance to mention my Twitter account before I leave today.
Sure.
But they're so connected today, and if something happens on the other side of the world, they instantly know about it, and they can become outraged, and they can become passionate, and then they can make a decision to be able to do something about it. Today's young people, if you think about Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists, the way they communicated the inhumanity of slavery at that time was they used the communication tools that they had at their disposal. They published newspapers and wrote books and gave speeches and passed out leaflets and pamphlets. Well, today's students hold the greatest communication tool known to man in the palm of their hands, and the way that they're communicating with each other on a daily basis through text messaging and Twitter and Facebook, they can communicate with more people through the stroke of a key than Frederick Douglass probably could have communicated during his lifetime of publishing the North Star newspaper, which was the leading abolitionist voice of the time. So we really believe that we can mobilize young people, have them use the tools that they're so familiar with to be able to help us raise awareness about this issue. Because if people don't know about it, you mentioned the show Weeds. The reason that that show was even produced was because somebody heard that this exists. So when you get it out there and people understand and know that it exists, now you can start to use your talents, your passions. You can donate your time to organizations. You could do a radio show about this, and then people hear that it exists, and then we can start to affect change. The experts in this around this issue say that raising awareness is key to ending slavery in our lifetime, and we believe that we can do it.
Most definitely. Well, you've got a new champion right here, because this is, ever since I heard you speak, everywhere I go, I tell people, do you know that this exists? Or are you aware that this exists? And people are just like, really, people don't know.
Right.
They really don't. So let's go back to the beginning with Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and talk a little bit about who they were.
Okay.
And how you ended up in their bloodline.
It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Just by the grace of God, it's not something that I obviously planned, and I don't know why.
Because you were a mere sparkle in someone's eye at the time.
I guess you have to ask my dad that. But no, I'm certainly very, very proud of this incredible lineage, and I've always known, as early as I can remember, that I'm a descendant of both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. Just to let you know how it happened, I am the great, great, great grandson of Frederick Douglass, and I'm the great, great grandson of Booker T. Washington. And I always like to tell people, because not only is it a mouthful trying to spit out all of those grades, but it sometimes does make me feel very far removed. And when I talk to people, they have a hard time sometimes even imagining what my connection is to these two historic giants. And young people think, when they look in the history books and they see a Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington and they hear about slavery, they think that it happened so long ago. But I always love to talk about my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, whom I was very close to. She lived to be 101 years old, and she lived well into my 20s. And she actually met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. And then my Aunt Portia, who lived to be 95 years old, I was also very close to her. She was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny's lap, and she would tell me what it was like to know or meet, as she called him, the man with the great big white hair. And if you've seen pictures of Frederick Douglass, you know what I'm talking about. And then my Aunt Portia would talk about her father, Booker T. Washington. And one day it hit me that hands that actually touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touch mine. I can say, in a sense, I stand just one person away from history, and we're not that far removed from history. And I always like to share those stories with young people so that they can just understand that this didn't happen that long ago. Frederick Douglass was probably one of the most important abolitionists that this country has seen, and he was born a slave. He was born into horrific conditions where he had to sleep headfirst in a potato sack on a dirt floor with his feet hanging out, because that was the only way that he could try and keep warm. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was 8 years old. He would teach himself to read and to write over the objections of his overseers, because it was illegal to teach a slave how to read and write. One of the ways that he taught himself to do that was by trading bread for reading lessons. And another thing that I like to share with young people just about trading bread for reading lessons, that he later wrote in his autobiography, is that as a slave boy, he was so hungry that he always had a pit of hunger in his stomach. There was never enough food to eat. And the few times that they did get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a pig's trough, and all of the little slave children would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to try and eat what little food was in that trough, to eat like animals, to eat like pigs, to eat like the property that they were considered. And now, can you imagine, what does that say about the value of reading and writing and the power of knowledge, that now he would take something that was so important to him, food, and trade it for reading lessons? He would go on to finally escape the chains of slavery. When he was 20 years old, he would eventually wind up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he would meet up with the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison was so impressed with this young runaway slave and fugitive slave, because he wasn't free at the time, that he just asked him to start telling his story. And he would get up in front of audiences and he would start to describe slavery and what it looked like to him. Well, people didn't believe that he was a slave, had ever been a slave, because he was so eloquent, he was so well spoken, his presentations were so strong that Garrison actually asked him to kind of, dumb down what he was doing, because people would never believe it. So he would go on to write his first autobiography, the narrative of Frederick Douglass, The Life of an American Slave, where he would tell his story. He would name names and he would name places. He didn't know that was going to become a bestseller. So he wound up having to flee to Europe for a couple of years because he was in danger of being captured and sent back to his master. Now, he would go on to be advisor to presidents, to Abraham Lincoln. He was very influential in convincing Abraham Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing 4 million slaves in 1865. And then he would go on to fight for women's rights, and he was just an incredible self-taught scholar. He never spent one day of his life in a classroom. Booker T. Washington, also born a slave. Now, he and his family would benefit from the work that Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists did when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. He was 9 years old. He wanted to go to school so badly to learn to read and write that he would work in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia hours upon end during the day just to save enough money to go to school. He would enter Hampton when he was just 16 years old. He would go on to graduate and then start Tuskegee Normal School, which is now Tuskegee University in Tuskegee, Alabama, when he was just 25 years old. He started that school as a means of giving freed African Americans a trade, to give them a tool so that they could have a stake in the nation's growing economy, so that they can participate, so they had something that they knew how to do. So I say that he was the one person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. So really those are, in a nutshell, their life stories and what they were about.
Let's talk about the word abolitionist, because a lot of people are like, yeah, I heard that in history class, or I heard my parents speak about it at some point. What does that word mean? What is an abolitionist, and who were they?
Well, abolitionists in the 19th century were people that agitated for the ending of slavery, to abolish slavery. So they were known as abolitionists. We use the term the same way today as a modern-day abolitionist, and these are people. I consider myself an abolitionist. I am somebody that is working to abolish today's slavery. So the term is something that dates way back to the 16th century and beyond, but it's a term that just talks about a person or a movement to end slavery.
Okay, so now the thrust of the Frederick Douglass Family Foundation is to inspire a new generation of modern-day abolitionists.
Yes, a 21st century abolitionist movement.
Now that you have the knowledge, what are you going to do? There's more coming up on the Community Review, Hot 92.3. Don't go away.